Next, let's cover a little more on demography and the changing demographics of California, the change in the breakdown of different types of ethnic groups. Just a broad example, in 1970, 80% of Californians were white, non-Hispanic. That's the way people are counted with the census, that there is a race category and also a Hispanic or non-Hispanic category. So what we often call, white people made up about 80% of California, but now that's less than half of that. So in fact, the majority of Californians are Hispanic Latino versus about 38% of white, pretty much even. There's also significant Asian population, that California has one of the larger Asian populations in the country, and then also significant African American or Black population in California. This figure from your book shows some of the, it shows population density, but it's also color coded with different ethnic groups. And so, for example, there's high concentrations of Asian Americans in the Bay Area and Los Angeles areas, high population of Hispanics in the Central Valley, and so on. A couple of trends in changing population. One is counter-urbanization. And so from after World War II, when the road system and automobiles became available, people had greater mobility and moved out of the inner cities. So you had what was called white flight, where as with changing demographics in many of the cities, people moved, many people who originally lived in the cities moved out to the suburbs. And oftentimes that sort of left behind, that sort of changed the demographics of cities that were once more racially mixed, became more concentrated, became a little less diverse. So in the Los Angeles areas, you can see the remnants of that, where as people moved out of the kind of inner part of Los Angeles, it left behind higher concentrations of African Americans, and where a lot of people moved out to the suburbs. And what we're seeing now too is a reverse of that, of gentrification. This is where people are moving from the outer suburbs back into the inner city. That can cause problems because it changes the rents. The rents go up, old buildings get knocked down to make new condos, and it increases housing prices for those people who were kind of left in the inner city, then are sort of secondarily displaced, and then they go back to the suburbs. There's a kind of a weird ebb and tide of people moving in and out of urban areas. But this is talked by numbers. If you look at population in California, let's look at the counties. Los Angeles County dwarfs the size of any other counties in terms of population. In fact, it is the most populated county in the United States. It has about 10 million people in the Los Angeles County alone. After that is San Diego, Orange, and so on. Fresno is down here, about a little under 1 million. If we look at cities, and we're kind of looking within the city boundaries rather than the entire urban area, Los Angeles is the largest city in California, about 4 million people, followed by San Diego and San Jose, and San Francisco. And Fresno is actually right after San Francisco, with a population of just over 500,000. By the way, one thing I'll highlight here is that if you look at the population for San Francisco County, 875 million, I'm sorry, 875,000, it is equivalent to the size of the city, because the city and the county are the same. One thing about San Francisco is that it is surrounded by the bay, so there's not a lot of room for it to grow. All right, so together, Los Angeles and San Francisco have about 2/3 of the population. They're metropolitan areas that include the suburbs nearby. That's about 2/3 of the population of California. The metropolitan area of Los Angeles is the second largest in the United States, just behind New York City. And the San Francisco Bay Area, kind of around here, is the 4th largest metropolitan area. Now, we're not just talking about the city itself, but the neighboring Bay Area, including San Jose and East Bay, Oakland, and so on. And it's the fourth largest metropolitan area, just behind Chicago area. In California, the San Francisco area is the densest because it is sort of locked into this little peninsula. Outside of the Los Angeles, San Francisco area, we have down here, and we have the San Diego area. And one area of growth recent area of growth has been in the south near the Tijuana, near the border, that international trade from Mexico has kind of promoted growth in this area. You also have people who work in Tijuana but live on the other side in the southern San Diego area. This area in here, if you have Los Angeles, it kind of spreads into this inland desert. This is called the Inland Empire. And so we've had a lot of outgrowth from Los Angeles into these inland deserts. The Central Valley has grown rapidly as well. That if you look at the cities in California with over 300,000 people, 4 of those are in the Central Valley, including Sacramento in the north, Fresno, we're about here, Bakersfield in the south, and also Stockton in between Fresno and Sacramento. Along the Central Coast here, the cities are quite small, but they've experienced a lot of growth. It's a very attractive area. People like to live there. And it sits between the 2 population centers of the Bay Area and the Los Angeles area. If we look at where there's less population, some of the least populated areas of the state are in the north. So in the northeastern California, north central, and these areas the largest. And in this part, the largest city is Susanville, which only about 15,000 people. If you look at the very extreme north of California, if you go along the coast there is a population cluster around Arcata Bay here. It's quite isolated from the rest of the state, but they have a bit larger populations. But these are relatively small populations in the far north of California. Much of the population is concentrated from about Sacramento south. And if you look at estimated future growth in California, a lot of that is going to be in the communities that neighbor the Bay Area or Los Angeles. So this is by numbers, the numeric change. So there's going to be more people by numbers in Los Angeles, but by percentages, it's going to be a greater amount in the neighboring counties like Kern, San Bernardino, and so on. Here in the Bay Area, you can't really fit that many more people into San Francisco, but you will see growth in the area around San Francisco, these neighboring communities, and then even into the Central Valley, you're going to have higher percentage growths.